In this video, we're going to see whether or not the pro-life argument can be maintained in the face of Thomson's criticism, and more generally the question that's been raised about the relationship between, on the one hand, the mother's bodily autonomy, and on the other hand, the fetus's right to life. So, the pro-life proponent wants to argue let's make the following claims. Killing the violinist is allowed by your bodily autonomy, but in at least central cases, killing the embryo or fetus is not allowed by the mother's bodily autonomy. Whereas the pro-choice proponent wants to say killing the embryo or fetus is allowed by the mother's bodily autonomy, or by the mother's rights in general, and there are actually a couple different rights that might be relevant. So one is the right to self-defense. So if the pregnancy threatens the mother's health, then terminating the pregnancy would be an act of self-defense, which is a right that we in general have. The mother's bodily autonomy would allow her to terminate the pregnancy if the pregnancy arose from non-consensual sex, and even the mother's bodily autonomy would allow her to terminate the pregnancy if the pregnancy arose from consensual sex but birth control was used. So that's where we're going to see Thomson try to end up by the end of the next video. In this video, we're going to see how the pro-life proponent might try to make out their case that while killing the violinist is allowed by bodily autonomy, in the central cases, the mother's rights, including bodily autonomy, do not in general allow her to terminate a pregnancy. So, one way to do this would be by talking about murder, which is terminology that you frequently hear when pro-life proponents make their arguments. So, we want to here distinguish between murder and killing. So, all murder is killing, but some killing is not murder. What are examples of cases of killing that aren't murder? Well, so someone who's trying to help another person might accidentally kill the person they're trying to help while they're trying to help. So this happened to my grandmother. She was very elderly, had and needed to go in for surgery in order to repair a condition, and unfortunately she died during the surgery. And so she was killed by the surgeon. Her death was hastened, but it was while trying to help her. Or again, you might kill someone in self-defense, and that might not be murder. Or again, there are cases, there's what's called manslaughter, which is where you might kill someone while acting violently towards them, but your intent was not to kill. It was to harm, perhaps, but not to kill. Or there are other kinds of manslaughter, but the point is you act wrongly towards someone, but not with the intent to kill, and yet they unfortunately die. So murder in particular is an unjust killing where the goal, probably with the goal of causing death. So bodily autonomy may allow killing, as in the violinist case, the pro-life proponent might allow, but no one thinks that bodily autonomy allows murder. And abortion is murder, says the pro-life proponent, and therefore a bodily autonomy doesn't allow abortion. However, this is not a very good argument. The question is abortion unjust killing? Is abortion murder? We know it's killing, is it murder? Abortion is not unjust killing if it's allowed by autonomy. It's not murder if it's allowed by bodily autonomy. And it's at issue whether or not abortion is unjust, whether or not abortion is allowed by bodily autonomy. So when this pro-life proponent makes the previous argument and calls abortion murder, they have assumed what's at issue in the debate. So the argument doesn't help. Saying abortion is murder is a statement of the conclusion. It's not a premise that's going to help the pro-life proponent. So we want to instead see how the pro-life proponent might revise their argument. So we have these two claims from the previous argument. The embryo and fetus have a valuable future, and if a being has a valuable future, it has a right to life, and that tells us that the embryo and fetus have a right to life. Right, and Thomson is granting this part of the argument for the sake of her other criticism of the pro-life argument. So the pro-life proponent might then argue as follows: a person's killing something with the right to life is prima facie very wrong, unless one of the person's rights allows the killing. And that's sort of the point that Thomson has been making, that there are cases where your bodily autonomy can allow a killing, and that's what happens in the violinist case. So killing is prima facie very wrong unless one of the killer's rights allows the killing, as it would in the violinist case. And then the pro-life proponent claims, in the central cases that are of interest, none of the mother's rights allow the killing of the fetus, and therefore, with those three claims, we can conclude that abortion is prima facie very wrong. Not in all cases, but in the central cases. In the central cases, the central cases are unlike the violinist cases. In the central cases of pregnancy, the mother does not have a right, that the mother's bodily autonomy does not allow the killing, and so the central cases of pregnancy, in this view, are unlike the central cases, or are unlike the violinist case. So that's how the pro-life proponent would make their argument in light of the violinist case. So the question is, okay, why is this? Why in the central cases should we believe that none of the mother's rights allows for a killing? Okay, well, the pro-life proponent might argue as follows. In the central cases, there are really two relevant rights that might allow killing: self-defense, when the mother's health is at stake, and the mother's bodily autonomy rights. If the mother's life is not threatened, then the self-defense right does not allow killing. And the pro-life proponent will claim if the mother is ethically responsible for the fetus, then bodily autonomy also does not allow killing. The difference between, so in the violinist case, your life isn't threatened, but you're not responsible for the violinist. And but if you were responsible for the violinist, if, for example, you had damaged their kidneys, then maybe it would be okay that you were responsible for the fact that they needed kidney support. Perhaps we could say, yes, actually, you do need to, be attached to the violinist for those 9 months while their kidneys recover from the damage that you caused. And similarly, the pro-life proponent thinks if the mother's ethically responsible for the fetus, then bodily autonomy doesn't allow killing in that situation. And the pro-life proponent goes on to say, in our central cases, the mother's life is not threatened, and the mother is ethically responsible because the sex was consensual. So the pro-life proponent concludes, in the central cases, none of the mother's rights allow the killing. The two possible rights that allow the killing are self-defense and bodily autonomy. Maybe self-defense, in the cases where the mother's health is threatened, allows abortion, but we're not, and so as for a legal matter, there should be an exception for health of the mother, as there is in all of the laws that we, even the sort of very extreme anti-abortion laws that we see, have exceptions for the health of the mother. But in those are sort of non-central cases. In the central cases, says the pro-life proponent, the self-defense is not an issue, and bodily autonomy, the mother's bodily autonomy rights is overridden by the fetus's right to life because the mother is ethically responsible for the fetus or embryo. So the central claim here is the senses of responsibility. It has to do with the responsibility. Is the mother responsible for the fetus in the relevant sense? So it helps to distinguish between two senses of responsibility. There's causal responsibility. I brought it about that, whatever. I brought it about that there's no food in the fridge, so I'm responsible for the fact that there's no food in the fridge. I dropped the glass, so I'm responsible for the fact that the glass is broken. And then but that's just, I made it, that's just because of what happened. And then there might be what we could think of as care responsibility or ethical responsibility, which is that I have a duty to care for some other person. These don't always go together. So, for example, I can have care responsibility without causal responsibility. So a babysitter has care responsibility for the children that are under care while they're in their care, but they didn't create the children. A more extreme case of that is adoption. If someone adopts a child, then they take on care responsibility for that child, even though they didn't bring that child into existence. A security guard has care responsibility for property, even though they didn't create the property. When you enter into a doctor's care, that doctor takes on some sort of ethical responsibility for your care. So there are lots of cases where we can have care responsibility without causal responsibility. And we can also have causal responsibility without care responsibility. So in adoption, again, let's consider the other part of adoption, the parent who gives up the child for adoption, the biological parent. The biological parent is causally responsible for the child's existence, but having given up the child, has at least much less ethical responsibility than they did before. Exactly how much responsibility is a good question. Maybe they have some, maybe they don't, but they certainly have much less care responsibility than they would have if they hadn't given the child up for adoption. And what we'll see in the next video are some other cases where Thomson's going to argue that we have causal responsibility without care responsibility that are very similar to the abortion situation. So in pregnancy, specifically, we just can distinguish between consensual sex and non-consensual sex, or rape. In non-consensual sex, the mother does not initially have care responsibility for the embryo or fetus, It was not in any way up to her that she got pregnant. We might think that if the mother stays pregnant for long enough and then starts to care for the child after the child is born, that the mother becomes at some point ethically responsible for the child, having voluntarily taken on care for the child, but initially the mother is not ethically responsible and does not have to take on that ethical responsibility. And this is presumably why in almost all, but not in some of the most recent anti-abortion legislation, there are exceptions for rape, because the mother is not ethically responsible. So, as I said, maybe a mother becomes care responsible for such a child, but she does not start off that way, and that's why the law in general reflect that fact. What about consensual sex? Well, the pro-life proponent says, yeah, the mother is ethically responsible for the embryo or fetus if the pregnancy arose from consensual sex, and if the mother is ethically responsible for the embryo or fetus, then the fetus has a right to use the mother's body, and so the mother's bodily autonomy does not allow her to kill the embryo or fetus. So this is really the central issue. When a pregnancy is due to non-consensual sex, the mother's bodily autonomy allows abortion. When pregnancy threatens the life of the mother's right to self-defense allows abortion. But what about when the pregnancy arises from consensual sex and the pregnancy does not threaten the life of the mother? And that's really the main case that's at issue in the public debate. And so the pro-life proponent will say, yes, the mother is ethically responsible for the embryo or fetus if the pregnancy resulted from consensual sex, whereas the pro-choice proponent is going to say, no, not in all cases. In many cases, in fact, while the mother engaged in consensual sex and pregnancy resulted, the mother is not ethically responsible for the embryo or fetus. And that's what we're going to see Thomson argue in the next video.